7 men were executed. The city blinked, then adjusted. No justice. No collapse. Just silence. Learning how to breathe. That's when power revealed itself. Not in bullets, but in what people decide to ignore. Capone didn't need terror. He needed acceptance. So ask yourself, when violence becomes routine, who's really in control? Chicago in the late 1920s existed in a state of permanent tension. The city did not merely experience crime. It was structured around it. Streets were mapped not just by addresses and districts, but by invisible boundaries enforced through violence and bribery. Every neighborhood operated under an unspoken hierarchy that determined which businesses paid for protection, which trucks were allowed to move after dark, and which police officers would respond when shots were fired. The city's machinery continued to function. Factories produced goods, trains arrived on schedule, banks opened each morning. But beneath that surface ran a parallel system of authority that did not answer to law. This system collected revenue, enforced loyalty, eliminated resistance, and protected itself with ruthless efficiency. By the end of the decade, this structure had a single figure at its apex, a man whose name no longer required context. Alphonse Gabriel Capone had become inseparable from the city itself. His influence was not limited to specific crimes or neighborhoods. It extended into municipal offices, police departments, courtrooms, and election campaigns. His presence shaped decisions long before they were formally made. Contracts were awarded with his approval in mind. Raids were delayed or redirected, based on his interests. Judges evaluated cases not solely on evidence, but on consequences that reached beyond the courtroom. Capone did not need to issue constant instructions. His reputation functioned as an enforcement mechanism, allowing the system he controlled to operate with minimal interference. The public understood this dynamic, even if official institutions refused to acknowledge it. Newspapers documented murders, bombings, and gangland executions with growing frequency, often linking them indirectly to Capone's organization, while stopping short of legal accusation. Photographs of crime scenes circulated nationally, reinforcing the image of Chicago as a city overwhelmed by violence. Yet despite the visibility of these events, accountability remained elusive. Arrests were rare, convictions were rarer still. The disconnect between crime and consequence created a climate in which power appeared absolute and permanent. Capone's dominance was not the result of chance. It was the culmination of years of calculated decisions, made in response to opportunity and risk. By adolescence, Capone had become embedded in New York's street gang culture, where hierarchy was enforced through intimidation and reputation. Violence was not celebrated for its own sake, but used strategically to establish control and deter challenge. Capone learned quickly that visibility mattered. Fear was more effective when it was predictable. Loyalty could be purchased, but only sustained through consistent enforcement. These lessons formed the foundation of his later leadership. His association with Johnny Torrio marked a turning point. Torrio operated differently from many gang leaders of the time. He emphasized organization, financial planning, and restraint where possible. Violence was a tool, not a habit. Torrio recognized in Capone a capacity for enforcement and administration that extended beyond impulsive brutality. When Torrio identified Chicago as a city poised for transformation, Capone followed, understanding that scale mattered more than territory. Cities with access to transportation networks and porous borders became hubs of activity. Chicago, with its rail lines, proximity to Canada, and politically fragmented governance, was ideal. The initial stages of Prohibition enforcement were disorganized. Local police departments lacked resources and often lacked motivation. Many officers viewed the law as unenforceable or illegitimate. Corruption spread quickly, facilitated by the sheer volume of money flowing through illegal alcohol operations. Politicians faced pressure from constituents, who continued to drink openly, and from criminal organizations that offered financial support. The boundary between public office and private enrichment blurred. Capone and Torrio exploited these conditions systematically. They established breweries and distilleries hidden in warehouses and remote properties. Distribution networks moved alcohol through trusted intermediaries, who understood both the logistics and the risks. Speakeasies paid for protection that ensured uninterrupted operation. Revenue flowed upward through a structured hierarchy, allowing leadership to maintain distance from direct exposure. The assassination attempt on Torrio in 1925 altered the trajectory of the organization. Torrio survived, but emerged convinced that longevity required withdrawal. His decision to step aside transferred control to Capone, who assumed leadership without hesitation. The transition was not contested internally. Capone's reputation for decisive action and uncompromising enforcement had already positioned him as the natural successor. Once in control, Capone expanded aggressively. Bootlegging remained central. but diversification became a priority. Gambling operations multiplied, generating steady income less vulnerable to supply disruption. Prostitution rings operated under centralized management, reducing competition and maximizing profit. Protection rackets extended into legitimate businesses, embedding criminal authority into everyday commerce. Each expansion increased revenue while tightening control over the city's economic life. Violence escalated alongside growth. Rival gangs resisted consolidation, particularly those controlling northern territories, under figures like Bugs Moran. Confrontations became more frequent and more lethal. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and targeted assassinations occurred in public spaces, reinforcing the message that resistance carried immediate consequences. Capone's organization demonstrated a willingness to act openly, relying on corruption and fear to prevent retaliation through legal channels. The operation was methodical and efficient, designed to eliminate leadership and destabilize remaining resistance. Although Capone was physically absent from Chicago at the time, the massacre was widely attributed to his organization. The absence of indictments did little to counter public perception. Instead, it solidified Capone's image as the embodiment of Prohibition-era violence. National reaction intensified. Chicago's reputation became a political liability. Federal officials faced increasing pressure to intervene. Traditional approaches to prosecution had failed. Witnesses refused to cooperate. Evidence was compromised. Local institutions could not be trusted. The challenge was not identifying responsibility, but proving it within a legal framework, resistant to intimidation and corruption. Federal authorities recognized that while Capone's violent crimes were difficult to prosecute, his income left traces. Illegal profits were still subject to taxation under federal law. Capone had never reported his earnings, operating under the assumption that acknowledging illegal income would create legal vulnerability. This oversight proved fatal. They examined expenditures, bank records, and testimonies from associates. The process required patience and insulation from local interference. Unlike police raids or criminal trials, financial investigation relied on documentation rather than witnesses. Numbers could not be intimidated. At the same time, enforcement efforts intensified under the leadership of Elliot Ness, whose team targeted Capone's operational infrastructure. Raids destroyed equipment and disrupted production, reducing income and increasing pressure. The goal was not immediate dismantlement, but attrition. Each destroyed brewery weakened the organization's ability to maintain control. The indictment in June 1931 marked a turning point. Capone faced multiple counts of federal income tax evasion, carrying significant penalties. His attempts to negotiate a plea agreement reflected a belief that the system remained negotiable. That belief collapsed when federal prosecutors took extraordinary measures to secure the trial's integrity, including replacing jurors to prevent bribery. The conviction in October 1931 ended Capone's reign. Sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, he was removed from the environment that sustained his authority. His incarceration at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and later Alcatraz eliminated access to privilege and influence. The isolation exposed his deteriorating health, the result of untreated syphilis that progressed into neurological decline. Released early in 1939, Capone returned to Florida, profoundly diminished. The man who had once coordinated vast criminal operations struggled with basic cognition. His organization continued without him, reorganized under new leadership. But his personal era had ended. He died in January 1947. His influence preserved not through continued power, but through historical record and cultural memory. Capone did not operate in a vacuum. He exploited systems that allowed corruption to flourish and violence to replace accountability. His rise was enabled by political decisions that underestimated consequences and institutions unprepared to enforce them. His fall demonstrated that power, however absolute it appears, remains vulnerable to methodical scrutiny. This is the architecture of power as it existed in America during Prohibition, seen through the life of the man who came to symbolize its excesses and its limits. Brooklyn, at the turn of the 20th century, was not a place that shaped men gently. It was a borough crowded with ambition and scarcity, where opportunity existed alongside constant competition, and where immigrant families struggled to secure stability in neighborhoods that changed faster than loyalty could form. For families arriving from southern Italy, Brooklyn offered work but little protection. Tenements filled quickly. Streets became extensions of the household, places where children learned to navigate authority through experience rather than instruction. Law enforcement was present but distant, often overwhelmed, sometimes indifferent. In this environment, survival depended less on formal systems and more on proximity, alliances, and reputation. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born into this world on January 17, 1899. His parents were Italian immigrants who sought the promise of American labor markets and the security of family cohesion. Like many immigrant households of the period, the Capone family valued work ethic and obedience, but external pressures limited their ability to shield their children from the realities of the streets. Education was accessible in theory, but difficult to sustain in practice. Classrooms were crowded, resources thin, and discipline inconsistent. For children surrounded by older peers already earning money through informal or illegal means, school offered delayed rewards compared to immediate alternatives. Capone's early years were shaped by observation. He watched men who commanded respect without holding official titles. He noticed how disputes were resolved quickly when one side possessed a reputation for retaliation. These observations were not abstract. They were reinforced daily through physical confrontations, territorial disputes, and informal enforcement carried out by local gangs. By his early teenage years, Capone was already embedded in this environment. He left school before completing formal education, a decision not uncommon among boys from working-class families, where economic contribution mattered more than credentials. Employment opportunities were limited, and often poorly paid. Street-level activity offered faster returns and clearer hierarchies. Gangs provided structure, protection, and a path toward recognition. Capone gravitated toward these groups, not as a reckless participant but as an attentive learner. Brooklyn's gang culture at the time was fragmented but disciplined. Each group controlled specific blocks or businesses. Violence was frequent but rarely random. It served a purpose: deterrence, enforcement, or retaliation. Capone learned to distinguish between impulsive aggression and strategic force. Those who survived longest understood restraint as well as brutality. Reputation had to be maintained, but excessive unpredictability invited attention from both rivals and police. Physical presence played a role. Capone was large for his age, strong and willing to engage in confrontation when necessary. This made him useful to older figures who required enforcement without direct involvement. It was in this capacity that he began to attract notice from individuals operating at a higher organizational level, including Johnny Torrio. Torrio represented a different model of criminal leadership. Unlike many local gang figures, he emphasized planning over spectacle. His operations were structured, his relationships transactional, his violence calculated. Torrio recognized that long-term survival required discipline and discretion. He saw in Capone a combination of loyalty and capability that could be developed beyond street-level enforcement. Their association marked the beginning of Capone's transition from neighborhood gangster to organized criminal operative. This mentorship coincided with a broader transformation in American society. The early 20th century brought rapid industrialization, urbanization, and political reform movements that sought to regulate morality through legislation. The temperance movement gained momentum, framing alcohol as a social ill responsible for poverty, crime, and family breakdown. These efforts culminated in the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol nationwide beginning in 1920. For individuals like Torrio, this development signaled opportunity rather than constraint. This created a vacuum that organized criminal groups were uniquely positioned to fill. Torrio understood that scale mattered. Cities with transportation infrastructure and fragmented political authority would become centers of distribution. Chicago fit this profile precisely. When Torrio relocated to Chicago to work under the Colosimo organization, he invited Capone to join him. The move represented more than a change of geography. It marked Capone's entry into a criminal economy that operated on an industrial scale. Chicago's population, rail connections, and proximity to Canada created conditions for mass distribution. Corruption at multiple levels of government reduced enforcement effectiveness. The city was primed for transformation. Capone arrived in Chicago around 1920, entering a landscape already shifting under the pressure of Prohibition. Speakeasies multiplied rapidly. Illegal breweries appeared in warehouses and basements. Alcohol flowed through networks that required coordination, protection, and enforcement. Capone's role expanded quickly as he demonstrated reliability and effectiveness in managing operations and confronting resistance. The assassination of Big Jim Colosimo, the head of the organization Torrio worked under, removed an obstacle to expansion. Torrio assumed control and began restructuring operations to capitalize fully on Prohibition. Capone became a central figure in this restructuring, overseeing enforcement and logistical coordination. His responsibilities increased alongside his influence. Chicago's criminal ecosystem was competitive. Multiple gangs sought control of territory and supply routes. Alliances shifted frequently. Violence escalated as organizations tested each other's strength and resolve. Capone's reputation grew as he demonstrated a willingness to act decisively. He was not reckless. Violence was applied selectively, often after attempts at negotiation failed. This approach minimized unnecessary conflict while reinforcing authority. The attempted assassination of Torrio in 1925 altered the balance of power. Torrio survived but concluded that continued leadership carried unacceptable risk. His decision to withdraw transferred authority to Capone, who accepted control without hesitation. The transition was swift and uncontested within the organization. Capone's leadership style emphasized expansion, consolidation, and deterrence. He understood that visible strength reduced the frequency of challenges. Under Capone's direction, the organization expanded beyond bootlegging, into gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. These operations generated steady income and diversified risk. Legitimate businesses were absorbed into the system through coercion or partnership, further embedding criminal authority into the city's economy. Capone authorized targeted assassinations to eliminate leadership and destabilize opposition. These actions were designed to produce long-term control rather than immediate chaos. Public perception shifted as media coverage emphasized the scale and brutality of gang warfare. Capone became the face of Chicago's criminal underworld, a symbol of both its power and its excess. By the late 1920s, Capone's influence extended into political and judicial institutions. Bribes ensured favorable outcomes. Intimidation discouraged investigation. Law enforcement agencies were compromised at multiple levels. Federal authorities observed these developments with growing concern but limited jurisdiction. Traditional prosecution methods failed repeatedly. Witnesses disappeared or recanted. Evidence was insufficient or contaminated. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 represented a culmination of these dynamics. The execution of 7 members of a rival gang shocked the nation and intensified scrutiny. Although Capone was not present, the massacre reinforced his association with extreme violence. Public pressure mounted for federal intervention. Chicago's reputation as a lawless city became a national issue. This concludes with Capone at the height of his power, having transitioned from Brooklyn Street gangster to undisputed leader of a criminal empire. His authority appears absolute. His organization functions efficiently. His wealth is immense. Yet the very visibility that sustains his dominance also attracts attention beyond the city's boundaries. Federal authorities begin reassessing their approach, seeking methods immune to corruption and intimidation. What follows is the systematic response to unchecked power. The next part traces how federal pressure intensified, how enforcement strategies evolved, and how the mechanisms that built Capone's empire became vulnerabilities. The rise is complete. The conditions for decline are forming. When national prohibition went into effect in January 1920, it did not arrive as a sudden shock. The legislation had been debated for years, framed as a moral correction to what reformers believed was a culture of excess and social decay. What lawmakers failed to anticipate was not resistance, but adaptation. Alcohol did not disappear from American life. It reorganized itself. Consumption moved indoors, underground, and into the hands of those willing to operate beyond the law. In cities like Chicago, the transformation was immediate and irreversible. Chicago possessed structural advantages that made it a natural center for illegal alcohol distribution. Its railroads connected it to the eastern seaboard, the Midwest, and the southern states. Its proximity to the Canadian border allowed for large-scale smuggling operations across waterways and land routes. The city's political system, fragmented among wards and dominated by patronage, created opportunities for influence at multiple levels. Law enforcement was divided among local, state, and federal authorities who lacked coordination and, in many cases, shared incentives to avoid confrontation. Capone entered this environment at precisely the moment when criminal organization shifted from opportunistic activity to industrial enterprise. Bootlegging was no longer about individual shipments or isolated speakeasies. It required production facilities, transportation fleets, distribution managers, security teams, accountants, and enforcement units. Torrio's earlier groundwork had positioned the organization to scale rapidly. Under Capone's growing influence, that scaling became aggressive. Illegal breweries appeared across the city, hidden inside warehouses, factories, and residential buildings, modified for industrial output. Equipment was imported, stolen, or repurposed. Workers were paid in cash. Production schedules were coordinated to meet demand without drawing attention through excessive traffic. Finished alcohol moved through predetermined routes, controlled by trusted drivers who understood both geography and risk. Any deviation from protocol was treated as a security breach. Speakeasies multiplied in parallel. Restaurants, clubs, hotels, and private residences converted basements and backrooms into drinking establishments. Each required supply, protection, and consistency. Capone's organization provided all three. In exchange, operators paid fixed fees or percentages of revenue. Non-compliance invited vandalism, assault, or closure, enforced through intimidation. Compliance ensured uninterrupted operation and insulation from rival interference. Protection extended beyond alcohol. Businesses that had no involvement in bootlegging were still drawn into the system. Owners were informed that protection was available for a price. Refusal was interpreted as vulnerability. Fires, thefts, and assaults followed patterns that left little ambiguity about cause and effect. The system operated openly enough that most participants understood the rules without explanation. Revenue flowed upward, through a hierarchy designed to insulate leadership. Capone did not handle daily transactions. He relied on lieutenants who managed specific sectors and reported performance metrics rather than operational details. This structure allowed rapid expansion while minimizing exposure. It also created redundancy, ensuring continuity in the event of arrests or losses. As the organization grew, so did the need for discipline. Capone enforced loyalty through rewards and punishment applied selectively but decisively. Associates who followed instructions were promoted, protected and enriched. Those who deviated were eliminated or marginalized. The enforcement was internal, as much as external. Capone understood that fragmentation posed greater risk than confrontation with law enforcement. Unity preserved profitability. Rival gangs responded with resistance. Chicago's North Side Gang, led by figures such as Bugs Moran, controlled significant territory and distribution networks. Competition intensified, as both organizations sought dominance over supply routes and customers. Negotiations occurred intermittently, but rarely produced lasting settlements. Violence became the primary mechanism for resolving disputes. Shootings increased in frequency and visibility. Bombings targeted businesses aligned with rivals. Public spaces became theaters of confrontation. Each incident reinforced the perception that Chicago was losing control of itself. Yet local authorities remained constrained by corruption and fear. Investigations stalled. Witnesses disappeared. Cases collapsed. Capone's visibility increased alongside his power. He cultivated a public image as a successful businessman and philanthropist, donating to charities and appearing at civic events. This visibility served a strategic purpose. It normalized his presence and complicated efforts to portray him solely as a criminal. He was not hiding, he was integrating. The assassination attempt on Torrio in 1925 accelerated Capone's consolidation of power. Torrio's withdrawal removed a moderating influence, replacing calculated restraint with Capone's more assertive expansion. Under Capone, violence became more centralized and purposeful. Assassinations targeted leadership rather than foot soldiers. The objective shifted from competition to elimination. Capone's organization absorbed smaller gangs or destroyed them. Territory expanded. Revenue increased exponentially. Estimates of annual income reached tens of millions of dollars, an unprecedented figure for a legal enterprise at the time. Cash was laundered through businesses, investments, and offshore accounts. The scale of operations required administrative sophistication that mirrored legitimate corporations. Political influence deepened. Campaigns received funding. Officials received incentives. Decisions aligned with organizational interests were rewarded. Those who resisted found their careers disrupted or their safety compromised. The distinction between governance and criminal administration blurred further. Federal authorities observed these developments with growing alarm. Prohibition enforcement at the federal level lacked resources and authority to confront entrenched urban organizations. Murder and assault remained primarily state crimes. Bootlegging prosecutions required evidence difficult to obtain without cooperation from compromised local agencies. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in February 1929 represented a breaking point. 7 men associated with the North Side Gang were executed inside a garage by attackers posing as police officers. The operation demonstrated tactical sophistication and complete disregard for public consequence. Although Capone was in Florida at the time, the massacre was widely attributed to his organization. The absence of arrests intensified public outrage. National media coverage reframed the narrative. Chicago was no longer a local problem. It was a symbol of Prohibition's failure. Political pressure mounted for federal intervention. The question was no longer whether Capone was responsible, but how he could be stopped. Federal agencies began reassessing strategy. Traditional law enforcement approaches had failed. Raids disrupted operations temporarily, but did not dismantle the organization. Witness-based prosecutions collapsed under intimidation. The solution required insulation from local corruption and reliance on evidence immune to coercion. Attention turned to finances. Capone's wealth was conspicuous. He lived openly, traveled extensively, and spent lavishly. Yet his income was absent from tax records. The Internal Revenue Service recognized that illegal income was taxable under federal law. This provided a legal avenue for prosecution independent of violent crime statute. Financial investigators began reconstructing Capone's earnings through indirect methods. Expenditures were compared against reported income. Testimonies from accountants and associates were cross-referenced. Paper trails emerged, where violence left none. The process was slow but cumulative. Simultaneously, enforcement efforts intensified through specialized teams led by figures such as Elliot Ness. These teams targeted production facilities, destroying equipment and disrupting supply. While not decisive alone, the raids increased pressure and reduced margins. His organization continued to operate, but scrutiny increased. This closes with Capone at his zenith and under siege, commanding a criminal system of unprecedented scale, while facing a federal response evolving beyond corruption and intimidation. The next part traces the tightening focus of federal enforcement and the gradual shift from dominance to defense. By the middle of the 1920s, Chicago crossed a point from which it would not return easily. Crime in the city no longer resembled disorder or improvisation. It had become regulated. Control was not asserted through constant confrontation, but through certainty. People understood what would happen if they resisted, delayed payment, or challenged authority. The absence of hesitation, not the frequency of brutality, defined power. In this environment, Al Capone's organization did not simply operate within Chicago's underworld, it shaped it. Capone's rise coincided with a shift in how criminal leadership functioned. Earlier gang leaders relied heavily on neighborhood loyalty, ethnic identity, or personal charisma to maintain control. Those methods proved fragile. As operations expanded beyond small territories, Capone replaced loyalty with structure and charisma with enforcement. Authority no longer depended on proximity or personal relationships. It depended on outcomes. Resistance was answered consistently and decisively. Compliance was rewarded with stability. This predictability created a form of governance that rival organizations struggled to counter. Violence under Capone was never accidental. It was authorized, timed, and calibrated to achieve specific objectives. Small acts of intimidation preceded larger ones. Economic pressure came before physical force. Only when resistance persisted did lethal action follow. This progression allowed Capone's organization to expand while minimizing unnecessary exposure. It also created a psychological environment in which rivals understood escalation as inevitable once certain thresholds were crossed. The Chicago outfit's internal structure evolved rapidly. To support this approach, roles became specialized. Some members focused exclusively on production and distribution of alcohol. Others managed gambling operations, prostitution networks, or protection rackets. Enforcement units operated independently, receiving instructions through intermediaries rather than direct contact with leadership. Financial managers tracked revenue and expenses with increasing sophistication. This compartmentalization reduced vulnerability and ensured continuity even when arrests occurred. Capone insulated himself carefully from operational details. He did not participate directly in violence or routine transactions. Orders flowed downward through trusted lieutenants, who understood both intent and limitation. This distance protected Capone legally, while reinforcing his authority internally. Decisions appeared inevitable, rather than personal, reducing the likelihood of impulsive retaliation from subordinates. Chicago's geography played a decisive role in consolidation. Control of rail yards, docks, warehouses, and major roadways translated directly into dominance over alcohol distribution. Capone's organization identified these nodes early and prioritized their capture. Neighborhoods adjacent to transportation corridors were targeted first. Smaller gangs operating in these areas were pressured through supply denial, intimidation, and selective violence. Those who complied were absorbed. Those who resisted were eliminated. This process repeated across the city. Independent operations lost access to suppliers and customers. Their revenue declined. Internal dissent increased. Leadership became isolated. Capone's organization waited until collapse was inevitable before applying force, ensuring that violence appeared as consequence rather than provocation. This strategy reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance and accelerated consolidation. Larger rival organizations required a different approach. The North Side Gang, controlling territory on Chicago's northern edge, possessed its own supply routes and loyal customer base. Its leadership understood the threat posed by Capone's expansion and resisted accommodation. Negotiations occurred intermittently, but failed to produce lasting resolution. Each side recognized that coexistence would eventually lead to absorption or destruction. The conflict intensified gradually. Isolated shootings escalated into coordinated attacks. Leadership figures were targeted deliberately. Each assassination destabilized command structures, enforced remaining members into defensive postures. Retaliation followed, increasing casualties and visibility. Public spaces became contested zones. Streets, restaurants, and garages transformed into sites of enforcement rather than commerce. Civilians were increasingly caught in the middle. Innocent bystanders were injured or killed as violence spilled into public areas. Fear spread beyond criminal circles. Businesses closed early. Neighborhoods emptied at night. Newspapers documented the chaos with alarming regularity, publishing photographs and detailed accounts that left little ambiguity about the scale of the problem. Local law enforcement proved incapable of intervention. Police departments were compromised through bribery, intimidation, and institutional inertia. Officers who accepted payments ignored operations or redirected investigations. Those who resisted found themselves marginalized or threatened. Prosecutors struggled to assemble cases as witnesses disappeared, recanted, or refused cooperation. Judges presided over trials aware that convictions could provoke retaliation. The legal system functioned procedurally, but lacked authority where Capone's organization exerted influence. Capone understood this paralysis and exploited it openly. He did not retreat into secrecy. He increased his visibility. Public appearances, charitable donations, and business ventures projected an image of legitimacy. This openness served multiple purposes. It normalized his presence within Chicago's social fabric. It complicated efforts to portray him solely as a criminal. It reinforced the perception that he operated beyond consequence. Economic conditions further reinforced Capone's position. The late 1920s brought instability to legitimate markets. Employment fluctuated. Businesses struggled. Capone's organization provided income and protection to thousands of people, from drivers and distillers to bartenders and bookmakers. Participation in the illegal economy became a practical decision, rather than a moral one. This dependence reduced public willingness to cooperate with authorities and blurred the line between criminal enterprise and economic necessity. As the rivalry with the Northside Gang intensified, leadership losses weakened its structure, but did not eliminate resistance. Remaining members retained operational capability and continued to challenge Capone's control. Each failed negotiation increased the likelihood of decisive action. Both sides recognized that partial measures were no longer sufficient. The events of February 14, 1929, represented the culmination of this conflict. 7 men associated with the Northside Gang were lured into a Chicago garage under the pretense of a business transaction. Attackers posing as police officers disarmed the victims before executing them at close range. The operation demonstrated tactical planning, deception, and a willingness to exploit institutional trust. It was designed not only to eliminate opposition, but to send an unmistakable message. Capone was in Florida at the time, physically removed from the scene. This absence provided a layer of legal insulation, but did little to alter public perception. The massacre was immediately attributed to his organization. Photographs of the victims circulated nationally, reinforcing the image of Chicago as a city consumed by gang violence. The absence of arrests intensified outrage and undermined confidence in local institutions. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre altered the national conversation. What had previously been viewed as a regional problem became a symbol of Prohibition's failure. Editorials questioned the effectiveness of federal policy. Politicians faced mounting pressure to intervene. Chicago's violence was no longer a local embarrassment. It was a national crisis. In the immediate aftermath, Capone's power appeared strengthened. Major rival leadership had been eliminated. Territory consolidated further. Revenue remained high. However, the long-term consequences were less favorable. Public tolerance diminished sharply. Federal scrutiny intensified. Capone's visibility, once an asset, became a liability. Federal authorities began reassessing their approach. Traditional enforcement strategies had failed repeatedly. Local cooperation could not be trusted. Witness-based prosecutions proved unreliable. Attention shifted from individual crimes to organizational structures. The objective became dismantlement, rather than disruption. Internally, Capone tightened discipline. Associates were monitored more closely. Information flow was restricted. Security protocols increased around leadership. These measures preserved stability, but increased operational complexity. Each additional layer of control reduced flexibility and increased the risk of internal fracture. Violence, once the foundation of governance, became a liability. Each killing produced records, witnesses, and patterns. Federal agencies began connecting incidents, constructing timelines, and identifying consistencies. Capone's name appeared repeatedly in reports, not as allegation, but as constant presence. The accumulation of evidence transformed perception into focus. By the end of the decade, Capone stood at the apex of power, achieved through systematic violence and consolidation. Rivals were largely eliminated. His organization dominated Chicago's criminal economy. Yet the conditions that enabled this dominance had also created the framework for intervention. Violence had stabilized the system, but it had also exposed it. He governs through fear and structure, commanding an empire that appears unassailable from within Chicago. Beyond the city, however, forces immune to intimidation and corruption are aligning. The next follows the transition from violence as governance to pressure as strategy, as Capone confronts adversaries who cannot be bought, frightened, or eliminated. By 1930, the United States government could no longer treat Chicago as an exception. What had once been framed as a local failure of law enforcement had evolved into a national crisis that undermined confidence in prohibition, federal authority, and the credibility of American institutions. The scale of violence, the visibility of organized crime, and the repeated collapse of prosecutions forced a reckoning. Chicago was no longer simply a city with gang problems. It had become evidence that the federal government had lost control of its own laws. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre accelerated this reckoning. While violence had defined Chicago for years, the massacre's symbolism proved uniquely damaging. The execution of 7 men by attackers, disguised as police officers, suggested not only criminal brutality, but institutional mockery. The impersonation of law enforcement struck at public trust. The absence of arrests confirmed suspicions of corruption and impotence. Newspapers across the country framed the event as proof that Prohibition had failed catastrophically. Editorial pressure mounted on Washington to act decisively. President Herbert Hoover faced increasing political risk. Prohibition enforcement had been a cornerstone of federal moral policy. Yet Chicago demonstrated that the law empowered criminals more effectively than it restrained them. Hoover directed federal agencies to prioritize the dismantling of Al Capone's organization, identifying him as the most visible symbol of Prohibition-era criminality. This directive shifted the tone of enforcement from fragmented intervention to sustained campaign. The challenge lay not in identifying Capone as a target, but in determining how to reach him. Years of failed prosecutions had demonstrated the limitations of conventional law enforcement. Local police departments were compromised by bribery and intimidation. State prosecutors struggled to secure witnesses willing to testify. Judges operated under constant threat. Raids disrupted operations temporarily, but failed to dismantle underlying structures. Capone's organization adapted quickly, absorbing losses and continuing business with minimal interruption. Federal agencies began reassessing assumptions. The problem was not lack of evidence in the abstract. It was the vulnerability of evidence to corruption, coercion, and disappearance. Any strategy that relied on witness testimony or local cooperation was inherently fragile. What was required was an approach immune to intimidation and insulated from Chicago's political ecosystem. This reassessment led to the elevation of financial investigation as a primary weapon. The Internal Revenue Service, previously peripheral to organized crime enforcement, became central. This principle offered a path to prosecution, independent of proving murder, bootlegging, or bribery. It required documentation rather than witnesses, arithmetic rather than testimony. IRS investigators began reconstructing Capone's financial life through indirect methods. They analyzed expenditures, property acquisitions, bank deposits, and lifestyle indicators. Capone's conspicuous wealth provided ample data. He lived openly, traveled extensively, and spent lavishly. His reported income, however, remained non-existent. The disparity between lifestyle and declared earnings formed the foundation of the case. This process was painstaking and deliberate. Investigators understood that any miscalculation could undermine the entire effort. Records were cross-referenced. Associates were interviewed cautiously. Financial patterns were established incrementally. Unlike traditional investigations, this approach advanced quietly, attracting little public attention while building a legally resilient framework. Simultaneously, the Treasury Department intensified enforcement through a different mechanism: operational disruption. Elliot Ness emerged as a critical figure in this phase. Selected specifically for his resistance to bribery and his disciplined approach, Ness was tasked with assembling a small team of agents to target Capone's alcohol production infrastructure. The team would later be known as the Untouchables, a label reflecting both their integrity and their isolation from local influence. Ness's team operated under strict protocols. They avoided contact with local law enforcement, except when absolutely necessary. Intelligence gathering focused on mapping supply chains rather than arresting individuals. Surveillance identified breweries, distilleries, and transportation routes. Raids were planned meticulously, executed rapidly, and followed by immediate destruction of equipment. Alcohol was destroyed rather than seized. Stills were dismantled beyond repair. The objective was denial, not confiscation. These operations produced tangible results. Production slowed. Replacement equipment required time and capital. Relocation increased risk. Capone's organization adapted quickly, but adaptation carried cost. Each destroyed facility represented lost revenue and increased pressure on remaining operations. While the raids alone could not dismantle the empire, they demonstrated that disruption was possible without reliance on compromised local systems. Capone responded by tightening internal security. Facilities were relocated frequently. Personnel were rotated. Information flow was restricted further. These measures preserved operational continuity, but increased complexity. Each additional layer of security reduced efficiency and increased the likelihood of error. The organization remained functional, but margins narrowed. Public perception shifted. As federal activity increased, newspapers began reporting on Ness's raids, framing them as evidence of federal resolve. The narrative changed from inevitability to confrontation. Capone remained visible, but the tone of coverage grew sharper. He was no longer portrayed solely as a powerful figure, but increasingly as a target. Capone attempted to counter this shift through public relations efforts. Charitable donations continued. Business ventures were emphasized. Appearances were managed carefully to project confidence and normalcy. These efforts slowed reputational damage, but could not reverse momentum. The federal government's involvement altered the equation fundamentally. The Untouchables' success also carried symbolic weight. Their refusal to accept bribes challenged assumptions about enforcement inevitability. Their operations demonstrated that corruption was not universal, and that resistance was possible. This symbolism mattered politically. It reinforced the narrative that the federal government could still enforce its laws if it chose to do so. Behind the scenes, IRS investigators advanced steadily. Testimonies from accountants and associates provided critical insight into Capone's financial structure. Some cooperated voluntarily, others under pressure. Each piece of information was corroborated before inclusion. The goal was not speed, but certainty. Prosecutors understood that Capone would deploy every available resource to dismantle the case once it became public. By mid-1931, the evidence reached a threshold. The IRS concluded that Capone had earned millions of dollars in taxable income without filing returns. The case did not rely on proving specific criminal acts beyond income generation. It relied on demonstrating a pattern of willful evasion. This distinction proved decisive. Capone became aware of increased scrutiny. His travel increased. Time spent outside Chicago grew more frequent. He monitored developments closely. Relying on reports from associates, confidence remained outwardly intact, but defensive measures multiplied. Attempts were made to negotiate with federal authorities, reflecting a belief that influence and compromise remained viable tools. Those assumptions proved incorrect. Federal prosecutors, backed by political mandate, rejected plea arrangements that would minimize consequences. The objective was not settlement, but precedent. Capone represented an opportunity to demonstrate that no individual was beyond federal reach. The indictment in June 1931 formalized this shift. Capone was charged with multiple counts of federal income tax evasion. The announcement reverberated nationally. It signaled that the federal government had found a method immune to the defenses that had protected Capone for over a decade. The charges reframed the narrative from gangster violence to legal accountability. Capone attempted to adapt. Legal teams mobilized. Strategies were developed to undermine evidence and manipulate proceedings. Bribery remained a consideration. Jury tampering was anticipated. Prosecutors responded with unprecedented measures, including the replacement of jurors, to protect trial integrity. These actions reflected the seriousness with which the government approached the case. As the trial approached, Capone's organization faced uncertainty. Leadership continued operations, but anxiety spread. Lower-level associates feared exposure. Some distanced themselves. Others prepared contingency plans. The cohesion that had sustained the empire weakened under sustained pressure. The trial itself represented a departure from previous failures. Evidence was presented methodically. Financial records replaced witnesses vulnerable to intimidation. The narrative focused on numbers rather than violence, stripping Capone of the ability to reframe accusations as exaggeration or bias. His wealth, once a symbol of power, became evidence of guilt. The conviction in October 1931 marked the collapse of Capone's immunity. Sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined heavily, and ordered to pay back taxes, Capone was removed from the environment that sustained his authority. The verdict resonated nationally, reinforcing the idea that organized crime could be confronted through institutional persistence. This act concludes not with violence or spectacle, but with transformation. The federal government had adapted its methods to confront a system built on corruption and fear. Capone's empire remained operational, but its leader was neutralized. The mechanisms that protected him had failed against sustained, methodical pressure. By the beginning of 1931, Al Capone's world no longer expanded outward. It contracted. For years, his power had been defined by motion. Trucks moving through the night, money flowing upward, orders traveling down the chain of command, rivals disappearing, territory expanding. Now the motion reversed. Pressure moved inward. Each week narrowed his options. Each decision reduced flexibility. The system that had once protected him through scale and intimidation now trapped him through visibility and accumulation. The federal government's campaign against Capone did not announce itself with force. There were no mass arrests or dramatic confrontations at the outset. Instead, there was quiet persistence. Investigators worked without urgency, unconcerned with headlines or immediate outcomes. They were not trying to disrupt Capone's operations directly. They were documenting him. Every visible sign of wealth, every property transaction, every expense that exceeded plausible income was recorded and cataloged. The approach was intentionally unglamorous. It offered no opportunity for intimidation or negotiation. It relied on accumulation rather than revelation. The indictment issued in June 1931 formalized what Capone had not fully accepted. He was not being challenged as a criminal leader, but as a citizen subject to federal law. The charges focused exclusively on income tax evasion. There were no references to murder, bootlegging, or racketeering in the indictment itself. This was deliberate. Prosecutors understood that Capone's power derived from the myth that violence placed him beyond accountability. Tax law dissolved that myth. It reduced the case to numbers, records, and intent. The simplicity of the charge concealed its severity. Federal tax evasion carried penalties severe enough to remove Capone from circulation permanently, if applied aggressively. More importantly, it required no cooperation from witnesses who could be threatened or bribed. It required proof of income, and proof of deliberate failure to report it. Capone's lifestyle provided that proof abundantly. He had lived openly, traveled extensively, and spent lavishly for years. His refusal to file tax returns transformed each display of wealth into evidence. Capone initially treated the indictment as a challenge, rather than a crisis. His experience had taught him that legal pressure could be managed through influence, delay, or compromise. He authorized efforts to explore negotiated outcomes that would limit imprisonment and preserve residual authority. These efforts reflected an assumption that federal prosecutors would prioritize expedience over precedent. That assumption proved false. The government's refusal to negotiate marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Prosecutors understood that Capone's symbolic value extended far beyond his individual case. He represented the public face of Prohibition-era criminality. Allowing him to escape meaningful punishment would validate the perception that wealth and violence could permanently neutralize law. As trial preparations intensified, Capone mobilized resources aggressively. Legal teams assembled with the expectation that procedure could still be manipulated. Past success had depended on exploiting predictability within the system, identifying vulnerable jurors, influencing court personnel, delaying proceedings until cases collapsed. Federal authorities anticipated these tactics and redesigned processes accordingly. One of the most decisive measures involved jury selection. Prosecutors arranged for jurors to be selected secretly and substituted without public disclosure. This denied Capone's organization the opportunity to identify and influence jurors before trial. The maneuver reflected a recognition that traditional transparency had become a liability. Security measures extended beyond jury management. Courtroom access was restricted. Monitoring increased. Procedural safeguards were reinforced at every stage. These changes were not dramatic but cumulative. Each reduced Capone's ability to intervene indirectly. The system no longer behaved as expected. Uncertainty replaced familiarity. The trial began without spectacle. There were no emotional confrontations or sensational revelations. The prosecution presented its case incrementally, relying on documentation rather than testimony. Financial records established patterns of income inconsistent with reported earnings. Accountants and financial intermediaries provided technical clarification rather than narrative drama. The emphasis remained on consistency and intent. Capone's defense struggled to adapt to this approach. Attempts to discredit evidence focused on technicalities rather than substance. Procedural objections slowed progress, but failed to undermine the core narrative. The defense's traditional advantage, disrupting witness credibility, proved ineffective against a case built on records rather than personal accounts. Each document reinforced the next. The cumulative effect was methodical and relentless. As proceedings continued, Capone's public demeanor remained controlled. He maintained the appearance of confidence, projecting composure and detachment. This posture had served him well in the past, reinforcing the perception that he remained untouchable. In this context, it became irrelevant. The trial advanced according to schedule, indifferent to reputation. Outside the courtroom, the impact rippled through Chicago's criminal ecosystem. Associates monitored developments closely. The possibility of conviction forced contingency planning. Capone's centralized authority had provided stability. Its potential removal introduced uncertainty that loyalty alone could not resolve. Leadership figures prepared for transition. Operations continued, but cohesion weakened as fear shifted inward. Public attention intensified as the trial progressed. Newspapers framed the case as a referendum on federal authority, rather than a dispute over taxation. Capone's name dominated headlines not as a criminal mastermind, but as a defendant subject to law. This reframing mattered. It stripped away mystique and replaced it with procedure. The verdict delivered in October 1931 resolved the uncertainty. Capone was convicted on multiple counts of federal income tax evasion. The sentence imposed weeks later reflected judicial determination to impose consequences proportionate to the offense. 11 years in federal prison, substantial fines, and back taxes ensured that Capone would be removed from the environment that sustained his power for the foreseeable future. The sentence marked the collapse of Capone's immunity. For the first time, consequences matched notoriety. The ruling resonated nationally, signaling that organized crime could be confronted through institutional persistence rather than violence. The outcome validated years of quiet investigation and procedural adaptation. Capone's immediate removal from Chicago altered the city's criminal balance. Leadership within the outfit transitioned to other figures, maintaining operations while abandoning the visibility that had defined Capone's reign. The organization survived, but its structure shifted. Authority became more diffuse. Caution replaced flamboyance. The era of public dominance ended. Capone's incarceration began at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Conditions there differed sharply from the privileges he had enjoyed. Influence diminished rapidly. Communication with the outside world was restricted. Control over operations evaporated. For the first time in years, Capone existed within a system indifferent to reputation and wealth. Rules applied uniformly. Violations carried immediate consequences. Health issues compounded his decline. Untreated syphilis, contracted earlier in life, had progressed into neurosyphilis, By the time of his incarceration, cognitive impairment became increasingly apparent. Memory deteriorated. Concentration faltered. The disease eroded Capone's capacity for strategic thought, accelerating his loss of relevance even within prison. Transfers between facilities reflected both security concerns and deteriorating health. Capone's placement at Alcatraz represented a symbolic endpoint. The prison was designed to isolate the most disruptive inmates, eliminating contact with external networks. Alcatraz stripped away remaining illusions of power. Isolation replaced influence. Routine replaced autonomy. Within Alcatraz, Capone's name carried no authority. The systems that had sustained his dominance, fear, loyalty, bribery, held no value. The institution operated according to rules enforced without exception. Capone followed schedules, not of his own design. The man who once governed through violence now submitted to structure, imposed by others. As his health deteriorated further, Capone became increasingly withdrawn. Cognitive decline reduced his capacity for engagement. The strategic mind that had coordinated vast operations faded. By the time of his early release in 1939, he no longer posed a threat. He returned to Florida, diminished physically and mentally, incapable of reclaiming authority. The organization he once led continued without him. It adapted to reduced visibility and increased federal scrutiny. Capone's absence marked not the end of organized crime in Chicago, but the end of an era defined by flamboyance and myth. Power persisted, but it operated differently. This act closes with the dismantling of Capone's defenses and the irreversible collapse of his authority. The case demonstrated that systems built on fear could be undone by patience. It replaced spectacle with record and myth with accountability. Capone's power dissolved not in violence, but in calculation. Al Capone's removal from Chicago did not occur with spectacle. There was no public collapse, no dramatic confrontation, no violent resistance. The transition from dominance to confinement unfolded administratively, carried out through paperwork, schedules, and enforcement procedures designed to neutralize influence without confrontation. That quietness marked the true end of Capone's era. Power that depends on fear loses meaning once removed from proximity. Distance accomplished what violence never could. When Capone entered federal custody following his conviction, the immediate effect was not physical hardship but separation. He was separated from information, from decision-making, from the constant flow of updates that had sustained his authority. For years, control had depended on awareness. Knowing which rival moved, which shipment stalled, which associate hesitated had allowed Capone to intervene early. Prison eliminated that awareness. The walls did not merely confine his body. They severed feedback loops that made power possible. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was not designed for theatrical punishment. It was structured for containment and routine. In this environment, reputation carried limited value. Rules applied uniformly, enforced through schedules rather than negotiation. Capone entered a system that did not recognize hierarchy beyond formal rank. His name still carried weight among inmates and guards, but it no longer altered procedure. Meals occurred on schedule. Movement followed regulation. Privilege was minimal and conditional. Initially, Capone attempted to adjust through familiar instincts. He observed, he tested boundaries, he assessed which mechanisms might still respond to influence. Small concessions were possible, but they did not translate into control. The scale was wrong. In Chicago, influence spread outward, across thousands of people. In prison, it narrowed to immediate surroundings. The compression of authority reduced its effectiveness. Power that once traveled across a city now struggled to cross a cell block. Communication restrictions proved decisive. Letters were monitored. Visits were limited. Information arrived late, incomplete, or filtered. Capone's organization continued operating outside, but without his direct involvement. Leadership transitioned gradually to others, who understood that visibility had become a liability. Decisions were made without consultation. Strategies shifted. Capone became informed after outcomes, rather than before them. This inversion eroded relevance. Health compounded this erosion. Long before his conviction, Capone had contracted syphilis, a disease he had neglected to treat adequately during his years of power. By the time of his incarceration, the disease had progressed. Early symptoms had been manageable. Under confinement, deterioration accelerated. Cognitive impairment emerged gradually, but unmistakably. Concentration faltered. Memory weakened. The strategic clarity that had once defined his leadership diminished. Federal authorities monitored this decline carefully. Capone's health was not treated as leverage or punishment, but as a management concern. Prison medical staff documented symptoms and progression. The diagnosis of neurosyphilis confirmed what behavioral changes suggested. Capone's capacity for sustained reasoning diminished. His ability to engage with complex information weakened. This deterioration further neutralized any remaining potential influence. As months passed, it became clear that Atlanta was no longer sufficient to contain Capone's symbolic presence. Though he exercised little real power, his reputation continued to attract attention. Federal authorities recognized that isolation, not accommodation, was the most effective response. The decision to transfer Capone to Alcatraz reflected this conclusion. Alcatraz represented a different philosophy of incarceration. Located on an island, physically isolated from the mainland, it was designed to sever inmates from external networks completely. Communication was minimal. Privileges were limited. Routine was rigid. The institution did not negotiate. It enforced. Capone's arrival at Alcatraz marked the final dismantling of his public identity. The prison structure eliminated opportunities for influence. Inmates were reduced to numbers and schedules. Hierarchy existed only within the institution's rules. Capone's notoriety offered no advantage. Guards enforced discipline consistently, aware that deviation created vulnerability. The environment accelerated. Capone's decline. Isolation intensified. Cognitive impairment. Routine replaced decision-making. Days became repetitive, structured entirely by external authority. For a man accustomed to directing outcomes, this loss of agency proved destabilizing. The skills that had once ensured survival and dominance offered no utility. Compliance replaced command. Capone's health continued to worsen. Symptoms of neurosyphilis progressed. Confusion increased. Physical coordination declined. Medical intervention managed discomfort, but could not reverse damage. The disease had advanced too far. The man who once calculated risk with precision now struggled with basic cognition. The contrast underscored the impermanence of power built without institutional support. Outside prison walls, Chicago adapted. The outfit continued operating under new leadership, avoiding the flamboyance that had drawn federal attention. Operations became quieter, less centralized, more cautious. Capone's absence altered style rather than existence. Organized crime did not disappear. It evolved. Public memory, however, remained fixed on Capone. Media coverage of his imprisonment reinforced the narrative of downfall. The image of the untouchable gangster confined on a remote island satisfied public demand for accountability. Capone became a symbol not of criminal success, but of institutional endurance. His isolation validated the belief that no individual remained permanently beyond reach. As years passed, Capone's relevance diminished further. By the late 1930s, he no longer posed a threat. His cognitive decline rendered him incapable of leadership or strategic thought. Federal authorities recognized this reality and approved early release in 1939, citing health considerations. The decision reflected pragmatism rather than mercy. Capone no longer required containment. His return to Florida did not resemble freedom. He lived under supervision, dependent on family and medical care. The structures that had defined his identity, organization, authority, decision-making, were absent. His days followed routine imposed by health limitations, rather than ambition. The man who once governed through fear now navigated basic existence. Capone's death in January 1947 closed the narrative without drama. A stroke followed by pneumonia ended a life once defined by excess and control. The empire he built outlived him in altered form, but his personal era had ended long before. The power he wielded proved inseparable from proximity, health, and institutional weakness. Once removed from those conditions, it dissolved rapidly. This act concludes with isolation as the ultimate neutralizer of power. Violence had built Capone's authority. Institutions dismantled it. Prison did not merely punish him, it rendered him irrelevant. The next act examines how Capone's legacy reshaped American law enforcement, organized crime strategy, and cultural memory long after his influence faded. Al Capone's removal from power did not end Chicago's criminal economy. It ended a method. What disappeared with Capone was not organized crime itself, but the idea that organized crime could operate openly, visibly, and with theatrical dominance without consequence. His conviction and isolation did not silence the city. They recalibrated it. Chicago did not become safer overnight, nor did corruption evaporate. Instead, power redistributed itself quietly, adapting to a new reality, shaped by federal persistence and public scrutiny. The Chicago outfit did not collapse when Capone was imprisoned. It adjusted. Years of hierarchical organization ensured continuity even in his absence. Capone had centralized authority, but he had also delegated extensively. Lieutenants who managed operations during his reign were accustomed to functioning independently, within defined parameters. When his influence vanished, those structures remained. What changed was the tone. Visibility, once a weapon, became a risk. Centralization, once efficient, became dangerous. Leadership transitioned without public acknowledgement. There were no dramatic power struggles, no overt declarations of succession. Decisions occurred internally, driven by consensus among senior figures, rather than ambition. The objective was stability. The organization did not seek to replace Capone with another public figure. It sought to ensure survival in an environment where public dominance now guaranteed federal attention. Violence, which had once been used aggressively to establish control, was re-evaluated. It did not disappear, but it was constrained. Public executions and mass shootings no longer served strategic purpose. They attracted scrutiny and generated political pressure. The lessons of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and Capone's downfall were unmistakable. Spectacle no longer intimidated institutions. It mobilized them. Operations continued across gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. But methods shifted. Financial records became more fragmented. Front businesses multiplied. Cash flow was decentralized to prevent accumulation that could be traced easily. Leadership avoided public exposure. Associations were kept deliberately vague. The outfit did not abandon power. It concealed it. Chicago's political environment adapted in parallel. Officials who had once relied on Capone's support recalculated allegiances. The federal government's demonstrated willingness to intervene altered local incentives. Corruption did not vanish, but it became more cautious. Transactions occurred further from public view. Bribery persisted, but it no longer operated with the same confidence. Law enforcement institutions absorbed lessons as well. The Capone case validated a new enforcement philosophy. Organized crime was no longer treated solely as a matter of violence and vice. It became a financial and regulatory problem. Federal agencies expanded their focus on accounting, taxation, and compliance. Interagency coordination increased incrementally. The idea that crime could be dismantled through indirect pressure gained legitimacy. The symbolic impact of Capone's conviction extended beyond Chicago. Criminal organizations across the country observed the outcome closely. Capone had not been removed through force or betrayal. He had been dismantled by procedure. That reality forced adaptation nationwide. Leaders reduced visibility. Organizations fragmented authority. Financial opacity became paramount. The era of the gangster as celebrity receded rapidly. Public perception shifted accordingly. During Capone's reign, newspapers had treated him as a spectacle, a larger-than-life figure who embodied both fascination and fear. After his conviction, that framing lost credibility. Capone became less a personality and more a case study. His story transitioned from headline to cautionary example. The public's appetite for gangland drama diminished as economic hardship dominated attention. The Great Depression accelerated this shift. As unemployment soared and banks collapsed, public focus turned inward. Crime did not disappear, but it competed with larger anxieties. Capone's imprisonment coincided with a national recalibration of priorities. The flamboyance of the 1920s gave way to austerity and survival. Organized crime adapted accordingly, embedding itself more quietly within struggling economies. Prohibition itself remained the unresolved variable. Capone's downfall did not resolve the contradiction between widespread alcohol consumption and its criminalization. If anything, it highlighted the disparity. Organized crime had thrived not solely because of criminal ambition, but because federal policy created sustained demand without legal supply. Capone exploited that contradiction ruthlessly, but he did not create it. As the early 1930s progressed, political momentum shifted toward repeal. The costs of enforcement, the scale of corruption, and the rise of organized crime undermined Prohibition's moral authority. Capone's case contributed to this reevaluation by exposing how effectively criminal organizations could exploit legislative idealism. When the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition in 1933, it removed the economic foundation that had sustained Capone's empire. The repeal did not eliminate organized crime. It transformed it. Alcohol revenue disappeared, but gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and extortion expanded to compensate. The Chicago outfit survived by adapting. Smaller organizations dissolved, others merged or restructured. The criminal landscape became less centralized and less visible. Capone's personal relevance continued to diminish throughout this period. His imprisonment severed him from organizational adaptation. His deteriorating health rendered him incapable of participating even symbolically. By the time of his early release in 1939, the world he had dominated no longer existed. The illegal alcohol economy was gone. Federal scrutiny had intensified. His former associates had moved on. Capone returned to Florida not as a power broker, but as a dependent. He lived under medical supervision, his cognitive decline increasingly apparent. The strategic mind that had once coordinated a vast criminal enterprise no longer functioned. His daily life revolved around routine and care, rather than ambition. The isolation that had neutralized him institutionally now defined him personally. Public interest in Capone faded gradually, rather than abruptly. He reappeared occasionally, in retrospectives and cultural commentary, but he no longer commanded attention. His name transitioned from current threat to historical reference. The myth softened. The violence receded into abstraction. The man became a symbol rather than a presence. Federal institutions continued evolving in response to lessons learned. Financial crime units expanded. Regulatory enforcement gained prominence. The precedent established by Capone's prosecution influenced future strategies against organized crime, including later campaigns against syndicates that emerged mid-century. The emphasis on financial accountability became a cornerstone of federal enforcement. The cultural legacy of Capone diverged from historical reality. Films, books, and later television dramatizations transformed him into an archetype. Violence was stylized. Complexity was simplified. The institutional failures that enabled his rise were often minimized in favor of individual villainy. This transformation served narrative appeal, but obscured the broader context. The historical reality remained less dramatic, but more instructive. Capone's power depended on structural conditions: prohibition, corruption, fragmented enforcement, and economic inequality. His downfall depended on institutional adaptation, coordination, persistence, and procedural innovation. Neither outcome was inevitable. Both were constructed. This act closes not with finality, but with recalibration. Chicago did not emerge cleansed. Organized crime did not disappear, but the rules changed. Capone's era demonstrated the limits of spectacle and the endurance of institutions willing to evolve. The vacuum left by his removal did not remain empty, but it did not permit repetition of his dominance. The next act turns fully toward memory and meaning. It examines how Capone's story was reshaped by culture, how myth replaced nuance, and how the man became shorthand for an era defined by contradiction rather than clarity. Al Capone did not disappear when he left prison. He disappeared when the country no longer needed to fear him as a living force. The transition was not immediate, and it was not dramatic. It happened through distance, time, and institutional substitution. Chicago had once revolved around his name, as though it were a permanent condition. After his conviction, the city adapted. After Prohibition ended, the markets that made him unstoppable stopped existing in the same form. After his health collapsed, his remaining capacity for command vanished. What remained was the outline of a story, an outline that could be repeated, reshaped, and used by people who had never met him. When Capone was released early in 1939, after about 7.5 years in federal custody, he returned to a life stripped of leverage. The federal government did not release a king, returning to reclaim a throne. It released a diminished man, whose authority had already been redistributed. Capone returned to Florida, to the environment where he had once sought distance from Chicago's violence and scrutiny. But the meaning of that distance changed completely. It was no longer a strategic retreat. It was the boundary of his remaining world. His health had been deteriorating for years. The progression of untreated syphilis had led to paresis, a condition marked by mental and physical decline. In prison, he had lost not only access to his organization, but also the cognitive steadiness that once allowed him to maintain discipline and assess risk. After release, that decline continued. He lived quietly and under care, removed from the operational decisions that once defined him. There were no new expansions, no new alliances, no new campaigns. The machinery of power had moved on without him. Capone's retreat into private life did not erase him from public consciousness. It redirected it. The country that watched him fall did not simply forget him. It stored him. Some stored him as evidence that government could enforce its laws when it chose to. Others stored him as proof that Prohibition had produced monsters. Others stored him as the face of a decade they wanted to explain quickly, without confronting every institution that had failed. His years in Florida after release became a hinge point in how his story would be told. In Chicago, he was an active force. In Florida, he was a symbol at rest. A symbol can be managed. It can be framed as caution, triumph, tragedy, or entertainment. A living force cannot. The shift from active threat to contained memory created conditions in which Capone could be made useful to narratives that served governments, media, and culture. Federal institutions had their own reasons to preserve the Capone story as a lesson. The prosecution that removed him relied on strategy rather than dramatic confrontation. Tax evasion was not the crime the public wanted to see punished. It was the crime the public could accept, because it produced a result. Investigators and prosecutors could explain the case as a model. When local corruption blocks murder prosecutions, financial law can still reach the profits that sustain violence. This was not moral theater. It was institutional logic. The Capone case became a demonstration that law could function even when fear and bribery contaminated traditional mechanisms. Within agencies that had struggled during the 1920s, this mattered. Prohibition enforcement had been humiliated repeatedly by the scale of organized crime. Capone's empire had shown how quickly black markets could grow when demand remained constant and supply became illegal. His downfall offered a counterpoint. Even the largest operations could be dismantled if agencies shifted from chasing visible crimes to documenting underlying systems. Financial investigation and interagency coordination were not glamorous, but they were effective. Capone's case made them respectable as primary weapons. Eliot Ness's raids also entered this institutional memory, though in a different form. The Untouchables had not been the final mechanism that convicted Capone, but their work fit the public demand for a visible struggle. Raids on breweries and stills created a cinematic impression of action, integrity, and persistence. In official memory, these raids illustrated that enforcement could operate without corruption, even in Chicago. In public memory, they became proof that one honest team could take on a criminal empire. The reality was more complex, but complexity rarely survives when stories are repeated. This separation between institutional lesson and public myth widened. After Prohibition ended in 1933, repeal removed the central market that had fueled Capone's rise. It did not erase organized crime, but it dismantled the specific economic engine that made bootlegging such a massive foundation for criminal power. That historical shift forced reinterpretation. Capone's peak had been enabled by national policy. When that policy vanished, it became easier to frame Capone as an exceptional villain, rather than a predictable outcome of legislative design. Repeal also reshaped the criminal landscape in ways that complicated the Capone narrative. The public wanted to believe that legal alcohol would restore order. It did reduce the scale of illegal alcohol markets, but it did not dissolve organized crime. Criminal organizations adapted by expanding further into gambling, prostitution, protection rackets, and over time, other illicit markets. The lesson was structural. When one lucrative market is closed, organizations that have already developed enforcement arms, corruption channels, and distribution networks can redirect those assets elsewhere. Capone had built a system. Systems do not die because one product becomes legal. They evolve. In Chicago, the outfit survived. It became quieter. Capone's downfall had taught its leadership that flamboyance attracted federal attention. The organization adjusted by reducing public spectacle and distributing risk. Decision-making became less centralized. Public visibility decreased. Violence continued, but it was deployed with greater caution. The city's criminal economy became less theatrical and more administrative. The absence of a single public kingpin did not mean the absence of criminal governance. It meant governance that sought invisibility. This shift mattered for Capone's legacy because it prevented direct comparison. There would be no obvious successor who dominated Chicago in the same public manner. The absence of a new Capone preserved his uniqueness and memory. He remained the emblem of the era because the organizations that followed him learned not to provide the public with another emblem. As Capone's relevance to active criminal operations faded, media treatment of him changed. During the height of his power, newspapers wrote about him as a living threat and a public spectacle. After his conviction and isolation, he became a subject for retrospection. The language shifted. Reports became less about immediate violence and more about biography, consequence, and interpretation. A person can be judged more easily once he is no longer capable of responding. Capone's decline removed the possibility of resistance. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Capone's story began to harden into a simplified arc. Poor immigrant beginnings, rise through violence, conquest of a city, and downfall through federal law. The reality contained many layers: mentorship under Johnny Torrio, the organizational transformation of crime under Prohibition, the complicated role of corruption, the shifting limits of federal authority. But simplified arcs spread faster. They satisfy a cultural desire for order. Capone's life became a narrative of ambition punished, even though his downfall was less a moral reckoning than a strategic prosecution. The film industry amplified this process. Long before Capone died, gangster films had already absorbed his era as material. The 1932 film Scarface drew on public perceptions of Capone and the Prohibition world, crafting a story shaped by dramatic necessity, rather than historical precision. It presented a gangster figure, whose rise and fall followed a moral and cinematic rhythm. This kind of storytelling did not aim to preserve institutional complexity. It aimed to deliver clarity. Crime rises. Crime is punished. The audience received an emotional conclusion. The real world rarely provides one so neatly. Over time, the gap between history and representation widened. Capone became less a human being, and more a role. His nickname, his image, and his era turned into symbols used to signal a certain kind of American violence. In this cultural framing, Capone was not an administrator running a large criminal enterprise with logistics and finance. He was a singular embodiment of ruthless criminality. The system that enabled him became background noise. The institutions that failed became invisible. This served entertainment, but it also served avoidance. A nation can reject a villain more easily than it can confront its own structural contradictions. The contradiction at the heart of Capone's rise was Prohibition itself. The ban on alcohol did not eradicate consumption. It criminalized supply. Demand remained constant, and in many places it increased. The law created a market that rewarded those willing to use force, bribery, and organization to control supply chains. Capone's violence did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared in a market where violence purchased stability, and stability produced profit. When that market disappeared through repeal, it was easier to treat Capone as an anomaly, rather than as a predictable outcome of law and demand. Capone's post-release life in Florida did not offer fresh material for myth, because it lacked action. It offered decline. Decline is difficult to dramatize without inventing events. It is slow, repetitive, and defined by limitation. Capone lived quietly, surrounded by caretakers and family, removed from public conflict. His Palm Island estate became a place of containment rather than expansion. This reality did not match the public's image of Scarface. But myth does not require continuity. It can freeze a person at his peak and ignore what follows. The federal government's narrative needs reinforce this freeze. Capone's conviction could be used as proof that government could succeed against organized crime, but the success depended on the optics of competence and persistence. The story of Capone fading quietly into illness was not as useful as the story of Capone defeated by the state. Institutions emphasize the moment of victory. They do not emphasize the slow decay that follows. Capone's death in 1947 completed his transformation into a permanent historical figure. He died in Florida after suffering a stroke and developing pneumonia. There was no dramatic public event tied to his death. Yet culturally, his death served as an endpoint that allowed the story to become fully closed. Once dead, he could no longer complicate narratives, contradict portrayals, or remain relevant to current fears. The public could finally treat him as a completed chapter. After his death, Capone's legacy hardened further. His name became shorthand for a period of American history defined by violence and contradiction. The Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, speakeasies, machine guns, political corruption, and federal raids blurred into an aesthetic. Capone became the human face on that aesthetic. His story was repeatedly told in simplified form because it satisfied a need for a focal point. This focus obscured the breadth of criminal activity during the era. Capone's organization was large and influential, but it was not the only criminal power in America. The broader prohibition landscape included many competing networks across cities. Yet Capone dominated memory because he was visible, and because his downfall offered a clear governmental victory. Memory favors the stories with clear arcs and recognizable faces. The label Scarface contributed heavily to this. Nicknames serve cultural memory by compressing complexity into a single image. Scarface suggested violence, toughness, and notoriety. It made Capone easier to sell his story. A full name and complex biography require attention. A nickname does not. The scar itself became symbolic, though the scar was only one small detail in the larger reality of his operations. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remained a central pillar of Capone's myth, despite the fact that no one was ever legally convicted for it, and Capone was in Florida at the time. The massacre became a defining image of Prohibition violence because it was cinematic in structure. Disguised gunmen, a confined space, a line of victims, execution-style killing. It suggested planning, institutional mockery, and ruthless ambition. Whether Capone personally ordered the event mattered less in popular memory than the fact that his organization was widely blamed, and that the massacre symbolized the era's brutality. Cultural memory favors defining images over legal nuance. This tendency shaped the public's broader understanding of justice. Capone's ultimate conviction on tax evasion, rather than murder, produced a strange moral imbalance in the story. A man blamed for widespread violence was punished for paperwork. This mismatch could have undermined the sense of justice. Instead, it reinforced a different narrative. The government is patient. The government will find a way. No one escapes forever. The public accepted the charge because it delivered the outcome they wanted. The charge became a tool, not a moral statement. That acceptance influenced future expectations. When later criminal figures were prosecuted on indirect charges, financial crimes, regulatory violations, conspiracy, Capone's case served as precedent in the public imagination. People learned to see indirect prosecution failed. The Capone story made it easier for society to accept that justice sometimes arrives through unexpected legal routes. Institutionally, this precedent shaped how agencies approached complex crime. The Capone case validated the idea that dismantling an organization requires attacking its infrastructure, not just its violence. It reinforced the importance of financial records, taxation, and documentation. It encouraged investment in investigators who could follow money and build cases resistant to intimidation. The success of the Capone prosecution contributed to the broader growth of bureaucratic enforcement methods in the federal government. At the same time, the myth of Capone as a singular villain shaped cultural complacency. Focusing on one man allowed society to avoid confronting deeper drivers of organized crime, economic instability, corruption, public demand for illegal goods, and policy contradictions. It created the illusion that crime is solved by removing the most notorious individual. In reality, the Chicago outfit persisted beyond Capone, and organized crime remained embedded in many American cities. The myth provided closure without resolution. Capone's story also shaped political language. He became a symbol used in arguments about law enforcement, strength, government corruption, and moral decay. Politicians invoked his era when emphasizing the need for stronger policing or tougher federal authority. Others invoked Prohibition's failure as a warning against policy that criminalizes widespread behavior. Capone's name could serve both arguments, because his story contained both lessons: the danger of uncontrolled crime and the danger of creating markets that empower criminals. The educational version of Capone's life often removed the most uncomfortable aspects. The role of corrupt officials was acknowledged but simplified. The failures of local courts and police were presented as background, rather than central mechanisms. Prohibition was often treated as a moral experiment, rather than a policy that created predictable market incentives. These simplifications preserved a clean story at the expense of structural understanding. For the public, the myth remained attractive because it offered clear categories: criminals and lawmen, vice and order, violence and justice. The reality was more entangled. Capone's operations depended on cooperation from people who were not criminals by identity, but by circumstance. Drivers, bartenders, accountants, business owners who needed protection, officials who accepted bribes to survive political machines. None of this fit neatly into moral categories. Myth erased these complications to preserve clarity. Capone's personal decline in Florida also contributed to the durability of myth, because it removed opportunities for contradiction. If Capone had lived long enough to re-enter public life, to give interviews, to dispute portrayals, to become politically active, his myth might have fractured. Instead, his illness sealed him off. The last years of his life were defined by deterioration rather than narrative intervention. The story belonged to others. In Florida, his existence became narrow and controlled. The estate environment insulated him from public observation. There were no public rallies, no confrontations, no new offenses. The federal government did not need to monitor him as a strategic threat because his condition reduced him to a health case rather than an operational leader. This reality did not eliminate his notoriety, but it neutralized its relevance. When he died in 1947, the public reaction reflected his transition into history. His death was news, but it was not crisis. It did not trigger new violence or political panic. It marked the closing of a symbolic era. The public could now speak about Capone without fear of consequence, which made myth-making easier. The more time passed, the less restraint existed in retelling his life. This closes on that transformation. Capone's criminal power ended through institutional persistence and legal innovation. His cultural power began afterward, shaped by simplification and repetition. The man who once controlled operations through fear and structure became an icon used to represent an era. The reality of his rise, created by prohibition, corruption, and market demand, became secondary. The reality of his fall, achieved through documentation and procedure, became the moral centerpiece. Al Capone's downfall did not end organized crime. It ended the belief that organized crime could remain permanently immune to federal reach. For more than a decade, Chicago had embodied a kind of institutional paralysis. Corruption and intimidation made local enforcement unreliable. State-level prosecutions collapsed. Witnesses disappeared, and violent power seemed to operate as a parallel government. Capone thrived inside that paralysis. His empire did not merely exploit a black market. It exploited the predictability of compromised systems. When he was finally removed through a tax evasion conviction, the most important shift was not symbolic, but operational. The federal government learned what kind of case could survive in a corrupted environment, and that lesson shaped its behavior long after Capone had been neutralized. The Capone prosecution proved that a criminal empire could be attacked indirectly. Federal authorities did not defeat Capone by solving every murder, breaking every bribery network, or securing witness testimony about the violence that defined the era. They built a case around income, records, expenditures, and intent. They treated the criminal leader as a financial subject rather than a battlefield opponent. That reframing did more than convict one man. It altered how agencies understood the relationship between crime and proof. Violence became something that could be acknowledged publicly without being prosecuted directly, while paperwork became the instrument that ended the reign. Once that instrument succeeded, it did not stay confined to Capone. Federal law enforcement absorbed the implications. In a system where local officials could be compromised, and where witnesses could be silenced, cases that relied on documentation rather than testimony offered durability. Tax law and financial scrutiny became not secondary tools, but primary ones. This shift did not erase the need for raids and arrests, but it changed their purpose. Raids became disruptive rather than decisive. Arrests became tactical rather than final. The decisive element became the long, patient accumulation of evidence that could survive intimidation. This new enforcement logic intersected with a broader transformation in the American state during the Great Depression expanded federal capacity and authority. National programs, regulatory agencies, and administrative growth reshaped the relationship between Washington and local jurisdictions. That growth influenced crime enforcement, because organized crime had long exploited fragmentation. When authority and information remained local, criminals could corrupt or intimidate local actors. As the federal state grew and coordination improved, those safe spaces narrowed. Prohibition's repeal in 1933 changed the criminal economy, but it did not dissolve it. The legal end of the alcohol ban removed the single most profitable and visible black market of the 1920s. It eliminated the economic foundation that had allowed Capone to scale his organization so rapidly. Yet repeal did not eliminate the networks that had been built to serve that market. Distribution systems, corruption channels, enforcement crews, and financial laundering methods remained. They were assets that could be redirected. The Chicago outfit, Capone's organization, adapted as it had always adapted. The leadership that took over after Capone's imprisonment understood that the era of visibility was over. Capone had been too famous, too public, too easy to frame as a national symbol. His successor leadership avoided that mistake. They reduced spectacle. They shifted toward quieter forms of profit: gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and other vice industries. The goal was not merely money, it was sustainability. The organization survived by becoming less legible to the public and less attractive as a federal trophy. This was not a moral evolution, it was a strategic one. Capone's downfall had taught a clear lesson. Public dominance produces political pressure. Political pressure produces federal attention. And federal attention produces the kind of sustained investigation that cannot be bought off easily. Organized crime did not become gentle. It became disciplined in a different direction. Violence did not disappear. It became more targeted, less public, and less likely to create defining images. The federal state learned complementary lessons. The Capone case demonstrated the value of insulation from local corruption. Agents who operated outside Chicago's compromised systems, and prosecutors who could build cases without relying on local cooperation, had a higher chance of success. This reinforced the development of specialized federal teams and task-focused enforcement units. The concept of selecting investigators for integrity and resistance to bribery became central to federal strategy. It was not enough to have authority. Agencies needed personnel who could not be neutralized by the very corruption they were fighting. Elliot Ness and his team represented one part of that lesson. Their raids had not produced Capone's conviction, but they had demonstrated that disciplined enforcement could disrupt revenue streams and gather evidence without succumbing to bribery. The popular memory of Ness sometimes exaggerated his role, but within institutions, the important takeaway was operational. Targeted disruption could impose cost, reduce capacity, and strain criminal systems even when prosecutions were delayed. At the same time, federal agencies recognized the limits of disruption alone. Raids could be replaced, stills could be rebuilt, supply chains could reroute, organized crime could absorb tactical losses, so long as leadership remained intact, and revenue continued. The Capone case showed that disruption needed to be paired with a strategy that removed leadership through a charge that would stick. This reinforced an emerging enforcement doctrine: use visible actions to reduce capacity and morale, while building quiet cases that remove the most protected figures. This doctrine influenced how the state approached organized crime in the decades that followed. The Capone story became a reference point for the idea that indirect prosecution could neutralize otherwise untouchable figures. Over time, that principle was applied not only through tax charges, but through broader financial crimes, conspiracy statutes, and regulatory enforcement. The essential logic remained: attack what can be proven with durable evidence, rather than what is most morally satisfying. Yet the state's learning process was not linear or uniformly successful. Organized crime remained embedded in many American cities. Corruption did not vanish. The repeal of Prohibition removed one massive revenue source, but did not remove public demand for vice. Gambling remained popular. Prostitution persisted. Loan sharking thrived where formal credit was unavailable. In many places, organized crime became more integrated into local economies, rather than less. The difference was that it learned to blend in. Chicago in the 1930s and 1940s reflected this blending. The outfit continued influencing businesses and unions, collecting payments, and maintaining control over gambling operations. But the city no longer revolved around a single public figure in the way it had around Capone. This mattered for federal enforcement, because the absence of a singular celebrity reduced the political incentive for dramatic headline-driven campaigns. The state could still pursue cases, but without a Capone-like symbol, public attention dissipated more quickly. This created a paradox. Capone's downfall strengthened the federal state's confidence and methods, but it also encouraged organized crime to abandon the behavior that made it easiest to attack. The state became better at enduring, but criminals became better at surviving. Enforcement and adaptation entered a feedback loop. Each federal victory produced lessons for the underworld. Each underworld adjustment required new federal methods. The Capone case was one turning point in that loop, but not the final one. Capone's personal decline reinforced the narrative of state endurance. After his early release in 1939, he lived quietly in Florida, his mental and physical health severely impaired by neurosyphilis. He no longer represented a strategic threat. His inability to re-enter crime or politics confirmed that his removal had been complete. He died in 1947, ending any possibility of return. This quiet end supported the broader lesson. The state could neutralize even the most notorious criminal figure and render him irrelevant. But the deeper, less comfortable lesson remained. Capone had risen because national policy created a market that rewarded violent organization. Prohibition had been an experiment in moral legislation that collided with widespread behavior. Demand for alcohol did not disappear. It relocated into illegal supply chains. Those supply chains required enforcement and protection, which rewarded violence and corruption. Capone did not invent that structure. He exploited it. The repeal of prohibition was therefore not merely a legal change. It was an acknowledgement that policy can create the conditions for criminal power. The state learned from that acknowledgement in a limited way. It became more aware that enforcement without realistic policy can produce unintended consequences. Yet the appetite for moral regulation did not vanish from American politics. Instead, the Capone era entered public memory as a warning and a fascination, often without full structural understanding. People remembered gangsters and violence more than policy incentives and corruption networks. This selective memory influenced later debates, sometimes producing calls for tougher enforcement without equal attention to the markets being created. Within law enforcement, the Capone precedent remained powerful. It encouraged the institutionalization of financial investigative capacity. Agencies invested more in accounting expertise, data gathering, and record analysis. Prosecutors became more willing to pursue cases built around paper trails rather than eyewitness narratives. This trend did not eliminate the need for human intelligence, but it placed documentation at the center of strategy. It also influenced how the state communicated about crime. Capone had been used as a national symbol of lawlessness, and his conviction became a symbol of restoration. This symbolization shaped public expectations. People learned to expect that the government could eventually bring down even the most powerful criminals. That expectation created political pressure for future enforcement victories, sometimes pushing agencies toward high-profile targets. The state's success with Capone created a demand for similar successes. Even when conditions differed, organized crime adapted again to avoid becoming a symbol. Visibility became the enemy. Criminal leaders learned to present themselves as businessmen, to maintain low profiles, to avoid the kind of public notoriety that had made Capone a national obsession. They also learned to diversify revenue streams, so that the removal of one market would not collapse the organization. This diversification made them harder to dismantle, and less dependent on any single policy environment. As the years passed, Capone's story continued to influence both sides of the conflict: enforcement institutions and criminal organizations. For law enforcement, it remained a foundational example of how patience and indirect methods could succeed. For criminals, it remained a cautionary tale about fame and concentrated leadership. The result was a long-term transformation of American organized crime, from a flamboyant Prohibition-era spectacle into a quieter, more integrated system that sought durability over dominance. This act closes with that transformation in place. Capone's downfall did not end the underworld. It altered its strategy. The federal state did not become omnipotent. It became more methodical and more willing to endure. The relationship between crime and authority shifted from open warfare and public theater into an extended contest of adaptation. Systems learning from systems. The next act turns toward the final phase of the series: the lasting impact of Capone's myth and method on modern American enforcement, politics, and cultural memory, and how the Capone era continues to shape expectations of justice long after the man himself became history. Al Capone's story ended in Florida, but the ending did not resemble the climax the public imagined. There was no final showdown, no last stand, no dramatic reckoning with rivals or agents. The conclusion arrived through deterioration, paperwork, and time. The man who had once been framed as the embodiment of Prohibition-era violence became, in his final years, a patient managed by family and doctors, living inside a shrinking world, shaped by illness. This quiet ending mattered because it revealed the difference between power and legend. Power requires proximity, attention, and functioning systems of influence. Legend requires only repetition. Capone's early release from federal custody in 1939 did not restore him to society as an active force. It confirmed that he had already been removed. By the late 1930s, the government did not view him as a strategic threat. Years in prison had broken his connection to the machinery that had sustained his authority. More decisively, his health had collapsed. Neurosyphilis and its related decline had impaired cognition and reduced him to a figure incapable of meaningful command. Whatever institutional leverage he might have retained was irrelevant once his mind could no longer coordinate the complexities of criminal governance. When Capone returned to Florida, he returned to a landscape that no longer resembled the world he had once mastered. Prohibition had ended in 1933, eliminating the core black market that had made his empire so profitable and so visible. The Great Depression had shifted social priorities and hardened economic conditions. Federal agencies had expanded their capacity, learned to coordinate, and refine strategies that depended less on witness intimidation vulnerabilities. Organized crime had not disappeared, but it had become more cautious and less theatrical. Capone re-entered history as a relic of a particular environment, rather than a participant in the current one. His life after prison was defined by containment. He lived at his Palm Island estate in Miami, surrounded by family, caretakers, and the routines required by declining health. The estate was not a headquarters. It was a boundary. His movements were limited, his contacts controlled, his attention diminished. He did not reassemble an organization or reclaim public influence. The man who once controlled a city's illicit economy could not sustain even the concentration required to manage his own public narrative. This distance between public legend and private reality widened as the years passed. Capone's name remained famous, but the public's image of him froze at his peak. The Prohibition kingpin, the symbol of Chicago's violence, the man blamed widely for an era's chaos. That image did not update to reflect his decline, because decline offered little that myth could use. Power and decay is not cinematic. It is repetitive, humiliating, and medically defined. For many, it was easier to remember the gangster than to acknowledge the patient. Capone's health became the central driver of his final years. The progression of untreated syphilis had led to paresis, producing both mental and physical deterioration. This condition altered his ability to think, remember, and function independently. The decline did not arrive suddenly. It progressed over time, reducing his capacity in increments. Each increment removed him further from the identity that had once defined him. The result was not merely weakness, but transformation. He became someone who could not sustain the traits, discipline, calculation, intimidation, that had once made him dominant. The federal government's stance toward Capone in these years was pragmatic. He was not a target to be hunted. He was an outcome already achieved. The government did not need to continue investing resources in a man who no longer influenced crime. This pragmatic stance also served a broader institutional interest. Capone's conviction had been a public demonstration of federal capability. His continued decline in private validated that demonstration by ensuring there would be no return. Cracked. Capone's death on January 25, 1947, came from a stroke and pneumonia. The specifics of the medical end matter, because they emphasize the quietness of his conclusion. The public had been trained by years of sensational reporting to associate Capone with violence and sudden death. Instead, he died as many people die, through the accumulation of health failures and infection. The result was a final reversal of the myth of gangster invincibility. The man who had seemed immune to consequence was not immune to biology. His death did not produce a criminal upheaval. It did not trigger a violent succession crisis. It did not mark an immediate change in Chicago's underworld. That was because Capone's operational relevance had ended years earlier. The outfit had already adapted to new leadership and new methods. The criminal economy continued. Capone's passing removed a name from history, not a functioning command center from the present. Yet culturally, his death strengthened the story. Death locks narratives. Once a figure is gone permanently, storytellers can reshape the life without fear of contradiction or return. Capone's death enabled the full transition from history to mythology. The man became a finished product. The story could now be retold as a complete arc. Rise, reign, fall, and end. Complexity could be minimized. Contradictions could be smoothed. The details that did not fit a moral narrative could be ignored. This transformation was already underway, long before 1947. Films, books, and news retrospectives had been shaping Capone into an archetype since the early 1930s. Gangster narratives drew from Prohibition-era public imagery, compressing a chaotic historical reality into structured stories that audiences could process. Capone's life offered an especially usable template because it included clear milestones: migration from New York to Chicago, ascent during Prohibition, association with spectacular violence, and downfall through federal prosecution. Each milestone could be framed as inevitability, even though historical reality was shaped by contingency and systemic weakness. The cultural legacy of Capone did more than entertain. It influenced public expectations about crime and punishment. The Capone story trained audiences to believe that powerful criminals are eventually brought down, not necessarily through direct prosecution of violence, but through indirect legal mechanisms that circumvent intimidation. Tax evasion became synonymous with the idea that the state can find a route to conviction even when the most obvious crimes remain unproven in court. This expectation carried forward into later decades, affecting how the public interpreted prosecutions of complex criminal organizations. Institutionally, Capone's case strengthened the legitimacy of financial and regulatory approaches to law enforcement. Agencies learned that documentation can outlast fear. They learned that indirect prosecution can succeed where direct confrontation fails. Over time, these lessons contributed to a broader enforcement model that treats organized crime as a system with revenue, logistics, and corruption channels. The objective became dismantling infrastructure, not simply arresting individuals. This approach shaped later strategies used against large-scale criminal organizations nationwide. Capone's case also influenced the criminal world. His downfall served as a warning against visibility and concentrated celebrity. Organizations learned to avoid providing the state with a symbolic target. They learned to fragment leadership, reduce public spectacle, diversify revenue sources, and conceal wealth. The era of the flamboyant kingpin receded, replaced by quieter forms of criminal governance, designed to survive long-term scrutiny. Capone's story thus influenced both sides of the contest, enforcement and adaptation. The larger policy lesson remained uncomfortable. Prohibition had created the market that enabled Capone's rise. The state's victory over Capone did not erase the fact that the state had also produced the opportunity. Repeal in 1933 acknowledged this failure, implicitly. Yet cultural memory often preferred the simpler story of a villain defeated by law. That preference allowed the nation to close the chapter emotionally without fully confronting the systemic drivers. Corruption, demand, and contradictory policy that had produced the violence. Capone became the face of an era because he offered clarity. His name allowed a complex decade to be summarized. Prohibition, political machines, economic instability, and fragmented enforcement could be reduced to one figure. This reduction was convenient, but it carried cost. It encouraged the belief that crime is solved by removing the most notorious individual, rather than by addressing the conditions that reward organized violence. Over time, Capone's name became shorthand in language and culture. It came to signify not only a man but a concept: gangster power, corruption, and ruthless ambition. The transformation from person to concept is the final stage of myth. When a name becomes a symbol, it no longer belongs to the individual's reality. It belongs to the society that uses it. This act ends with that transformation complete. Capone's power died in prison. His body died in Florida. His name continued living in culture, institutions, and public expectation. The state learned to endure by adapting its methods. Organized crime learned to endure by adapting its visibility. The public learned to endure by turning complexity into narrative. The prologue began with Capone as a young figure moving toward opportunity. The early acts followed his ascent through Prohibition's contradictions, his consolidation through violence, and his insulation through corruption. The later acts traced the federal shift toward indirect prosecution, the quiet removal of his authority, and the slow decay that followed. This final act leaves Capone where history ultimately places him, not as a singular cause of an era's violence, but as the most visible expression of how policy, corruption, and profit can produce a parallel order, until institutions change their strategy and refuse to stop. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.